The letters had gone soft at the folds, worn thin from the countless times Evelyn Marsh had traced her fingers over the ink. 12 of them, kept in a cedar box that still smelled faintly of her mother's sewing room back in Ohio. Each one carried the same steady hand, the same promise of a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. Thomas Harding. He had signed himself, a name that sounded, to her, like something a person could lean on. He wrote of his homestead outside a town called Piner Creek in the Wyoming Territory, of a valley ringed by cottonwoods and a well that never ran dry even in the worst of August. He wrote of needing a wife who could read and figure, who wasn't afraid of hard seasons, and in his fourth letter, the one she had read so many times the paper had begun to soften like cloth, he had answered a question she'd been almost too shy to ask. "There is a garden behind the house," he'd written, "gone wild these past years since my mother passed. It gets the afternoon light. I expect it would come back to life again under the right hands." It was such a small thing to hang a future on, and yet Evelyn had hung everything on it. She was 22, quick-minded, the kind of pretty that made people underestimate how sharp she was. And she had exactly one living relative left in the world, an aunt in Cincinnati who had made it clear, in the gentlest possible terms, that there was no room in her house for a niece much longer. So Evelyn had done what a handful of desperate, hopeful women across the country were doing that year. She had answered an advertisement in a matrimonial paper, and out of 9 replies, Thomas Harding's had been the only one that hadn't tried to flatter her. He wrote like a man who respected the truth too much to dress it up. The train had carried her 3 days west, through country that grew wilder and lonelier with every mile, until the trees thinned out and the sky opened into something so vast it made her chest ache to look at it. She had read his final letter so many times she'd memorized it. "I will meet the Tuesday train at Piner Creek Station. I am not a handsome man, but I am an honest one, and you will not find me hard to spot, as there is rarely another soul waiting there." It was Tuesday. The train was slowing. Evelyn smoothed the front of her traveling dress with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and stepped down onto a platform that was, but for a stray dog sniffing at a fence post, entirely empty. She waited until the sun dropped low and orange behind the hills, until the station master came out twice to ask if she needed anything, until the last light drained out of the sky and left her standing alone with her trunk and a silence that seemed to press in from every direction. No one came. There was no message, no explanation, nothing but the wind moving through the dry grass and the terrible, sinking understanding that whatever had happened to Thomas Harding, he was not coming to meet her. She had nowhere in Piner Creek to go, no family, no friend, not even an acquaintance. Only a name and a stack of letters that suddenly felt like the cruelest kind of joke. It was the station master who finally suggested she wait inside, out of the wind, and it was there, an hour later, that a man came through the door shaking rain off his hat, a man who was not Thomas Harding, who had never heard of Thomas Harding, but who took one look at the pale, still, dry-eyed young woman sitting upright on a hard bench with a trunk at her feet, and understood, without being told, that something had gone terribly wrong. His name, he said, was Caleb Whitfield, and he ran a spread a few miles out past the ridge. He did not ask who she'd been waiting for. He did not ask why they hadn't come. He simply said that the boarding house in town was run by a decent woman named Mrs. Dunmore, and that he'd see her trunk got there safely if she'd allow it. Evelyn, who had spent the last hours rehearsing every possible catastrophe in her mind, found she had no strength left to refuse a kindness. She allowed it. He walked beside her the whole way into town, leading his horse by the bridle, saying almost nothing, and somehow the silence between them felt less like emptiness than like room being made for her to breathe. Mrs. Dunmore turned out to be sharp-eyed and broad-shouldered, a woman who ran the boarding house and, as Evelyn would soon learn, the town's small post office besides, which made her the quiet center of every piece of news that passed through Piner Creek. She took Evelyn in without a single prying question, though her eyes missed nothing. and Caleb Whitfield paid for the first week's room before Evelyn could find the words to object, then touched the brim of his hat and rode back out into the dark without waiting to be thanked. She lay awake that whole first night in a narrow bed under a window that faced west, and let herself cry, quietly, for the garden she would never see come back to life, and for the future she had built entirely out of paper and hope. She had been a fool, she told herself. She would not be one for long. She saw Caleb Whitfield only once during that first week, riding into town for supplies, his face set and serious, and he did not so much as glance toward the boarding house, as though he considered the matter closed and wanted no thanks for it. Evelyn spent her days helping Mrs. Dunmore with the wash and the mending to earn her keep, turning over in her mind, again and again, the impossible question of what a woman with no family and no prospects was meant to do in a town where she knew no one. It was Mrs. Dunmore, in the end, who mentioned, almost offhand, that Caleb Whitfield had been asking around town for someone who could read and keep figures, on account of his sister having married and moved off to Denver the year before, leaving nobody to manage the house accounts, and him being about as comfortable with a ledger as a bear with a sewing needle. Evelyn had helped Mrs. Dunmore balance her own books in the evenings, a small, orderly comfort in a week that had otherwise unmoored her completely, and when Caleb Whitfield came by on the 7th day and stood in the parlor turning his hat in his hands, asking with obvious discomfort whether she might consider the position, she said yes before he had even finished laying out the terms. His ranch sat in a valley 2 hours' ride from town, but he arranged for her to come out each morning in the back of the supply wagon with old Gus, the ranch hand who made the trip into Piner Creek for feed and mail 3 times a week, and on the days Gus wasn't going, Caleb himself drove her out and back without comment, as if it were simply a fact of the arrangement and not a kindness at all. The house was plain and solid, built of good timber, clean but bare of anything soft, a house that had clearly gone a long time without a woman's hand in it. The small office he gave her had a desk, a window, and 3 years of receipts stuffed into drawers with no order to them whatsoever. "It's not much," he said, almost apologizing. "It will do very well," she told him, and meant it. The ledgers were, as promised, a genuine catastrophe. Numbers crossed out and rewritten in different inks, whole seasons unaccounted for. But Evelyn found in the tangle of it something like peace. It was a puzzle with a solution, unlike the rest of her circumstances, and she attacked it with a quiet, fierce satisfaction, her pen scratching in the stillness of the empty house while Caleb was out working his cattle from dawn until the light went gold and long across the valley. She was aware of him mostly by small signs. On the 3rd morning, she found a jar of wildflowers on the corner of her desk, some purple, some white, clearly picked in haste and set down without a word of explanation. There was no note. He was nowhere to be seen when she arrived. She set them in a cup of water and said nothing, and the next week there was another jar, and by the 4th week it had become an unspoken ritual neither of them acknowledged aloud. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him for it. It simply happened, the way the sun rose, a small and steady fact of her days. In the afternoons, when his work brought him near the house, she would sometimes see him from her window, mending a bridle or working a piece of leather with his hands, and she came to know the particular economy of his movements, the way he wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word. He was not a man who spoke his feelings, but she began to understand that he spoke them anyway, in the wildflowers on her desk, in the way he'd leave the good coffee for her and take the bitter dregs himself without remark, in the careful, deliberate way he had built a small set of shelves for her office one Sunday afternoon so her papers would have somewhere proper to sit. He watched her, too, she knew, though he was careful never to be caught at it, pausing sometimes in the doorway on his way through the kitchen, watching the light catch in her hair as she bent over the books, and looking, on more than one occasion, as though he meant to say something and thought better of it. One evening in early July, a full 2 months into her employment, he came in from the barn holding something behind his back, awkward as a boy, and set on her desk a small carved fox, its ears sharp, its whole shape caught mid-motion as though it had just turned to look at something. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely startled. He only shrugged, color rising up his neck under his collar. "Something to do with my hands of an evening," he muttered, and left before she could say anything more. She kept the fox on the corner of her desk after that, and found herself touching it sometimes, without quite meaning to, when the old loneliness crept back in. By the end of August, the ledgers were finished. 3 years of chaos folded into neat, orderly columns, and Evelyn presented the finished book to Caleb one evening as he sat on the porch step in the fading light. He turned the pages slowly, and it seemed to her that he was looking less at the sums than at the evenness of her hand, the order she had made where there had been none. "I don't rightly know how to thank you properly," he said finally. The words came out low, careful, as though thanks did not come easily to him and he wanted to get them right. "The work's done now," she said, and heard, even as she said it, how much she did not want it to be true. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening hills. "There's still the smokehouse accounts," he said, "and the seed order for spring." It wasn't strictly true, and they both seemed to know it, but Evelyn only nodded, and something eased in his shoulders, and she stayed on. The arrangement shifted after that, quietly, without either of them naming it. She began cooking the evening meal, and they ate together on the porch in a silence that had stopped being awkward sometime without her noticing. She mended his shirts. She planted a row of marigolds along the porch rail, a small, bright defiance against the plain gray wood, and though Caleb never remarked on it, she caught him watering them one morning before dawn, thinking himself unobserved. The memory of Thomas Harding had become, by then, a distant and faintly embarrassing thing, a story that belonged to a younger, more foolish version of herself. She told herself she did not think of him at all, but ghosts, as it happened, were not so easily put down. It was a cool afternoon in late September when Evelyn stood in the corner of Mrs. Dunmore's parlor that served as Piner Creek's post office, waiting on a stamp, while Mrs. Dunmore sorted through a fresh bundle of mail with her usual muttered commentary. "Now here's an odd one," she said, holding an envelope up to the light. "Comes from clear over in Larkspur County, addressed to a Mrs. Sarah Harding. That'll be from her husband, I'd wager, off working the surveying crews for the railroad. Sends one regular as Sunday." "Harding," she said again, frowning slightly. Only ever heard that name the once before, and then she looked up. And whatever she saw in Evelyn's face made the rest of the sentence die in her throat. In that single, unguarded moment, Mrs. Dunmore understood everything. The matrimonial advertisement Evelyn had never once mentioned, the long wait at an empty station, the careful, quiet shame she had carried like a stone in her pocket for months. "Oh, you poor girl," she said softly, all her usual briskness gone. What Evelyn felt, standing there with the truth laid bare in front of her, was not the grief she might have expected. It was something colder and clearer than grief, a hard, clean anger that rose up through the humiliation like a blade through cloth. Thomas Harding had not simply changed his mind, or met with some accident on the road, or lost his nerve at the thought of a stranger's wife. He had a wife already, a real one, in a real house, and he had spent months writing tender lies to a second woman, for reasons Evelyn could not begin to guess at, and did not, in that moment, care to. She walked the whole 2 hours back out to the ranch on foot that day, too full of fury and shame to wait for the wagon, arriving with dust on her hem and her jaw set hard. She found Caleb by the corral, checking a hinge on the gate, and something in the set of her shoulders made him go very still before she'd said a single word. "Caleb," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady. He set down his tools and gave her the whole of his attention, the way he always did, as if nothing else in the world was happening. She told him everything, plainly, without flourish, the advertisement, the letters, the empty platform, and now this, a wife in Larkspur County who had no idea her husband's pen had wandered quite so far from home. When she finished, Caleb was silent for a long moment, looking off toward the hills, and she saw a muscle working hard in his jaw, saw an anger in his eyes that was not, she understood, entirely his own to carry, but hers, borrowed and worn on her behalf. "We could write to the marshal over in Larkspur," he said finally, his voice flat and hard. "There's laws against a man doing what he's done, deceiving a woman that way, taking money under false pretense of marriage. It's a real crime, Evelyn. He can answer for it." She had thought of this herself, more than once, in the weeks since, and she let herself picture it for a moment. The marshal, the questions, her name written down in some official record as the foolish girl who'd been tricked by a stranger's letters, the whole of Piner Creek and Larkspur County both knowing her story before she'd had any say in the telling of it. "And what would it change?" she said finally, quiet but certain. "It won't give me back the months I spent believing him. It won't undo the fool I made of myself. The fault for believing him is mine to carry, and I'd sooner set it down than drag it through a courtroom for the whole territory to look at." She took a breath. "I would rather go forward than spend one more day looking back." Caleb turned from the hills then and looked at her fully, and something in his face changed, some final piece settling into place. He had watched her these past months bring order to his ledgers and warmth to his kitchen, and had told himself it was only gratitude he felt, only the plain relief of a man whose burdens had been lightened. He understood now that it had never been only that. He had grown so used to the sound of her in the house, the smell of bread rising, the particular quiet of her company in the evenings, that the thought of the place going back to what it had been before her, silent and bare, struck him as something close to unbearable. He'd been slow to see it, he thought, slower than a man had any right to be. That evening they sat together on the porch as the last color drained out of the sky, and the quiet between them was different than it had been before, charged with things said and unsaid. "Evelyn," he said finally, breaking it. She turned to him. "I've been turning something over in my mind," he said, and set his hands flat on his knees, as if he needed somewhere to anchor them. "This house was quiet a long time before you came. Too quiet, if I'm honest about it." He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't feel that way anymore." He drew a breath. "I'm not a man with pretty words. I never was one for letters, and I couldn't write you a fine one if my life depended on it. But I see what's in front of me, Evelyn, even when I'm slow about it. And what's in front of me is you." He stood then and walked to the porch rail, looking out into the dark. "This is an empty house," he said. "It doesn't have to stay one. I'd like it if you'd stay on, not to keep my books, as my wife." For a moment the whole evening seemed to hold its breath. The crickets, the wind moving through the cottonwoods down by the creek, all of it falling away until there was only the plain, unadorned weight of his question hanging in the cool air between them. It was not a fine speech, nothing like the letters that had once seemed to promise her the whole of a life. It was better than that. He had not offered her a garden that would bloom again, or an east-facing kitchen, or any pretty picture of a future. He had offered her only himself, steady and plain, and entirely real. "Caleb," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "I was hoping you'd ask." A smile broke across his face then, slow and unguarded, the first she had ever truly seen from him, and it changed him entirely, lit something in his eyes that outshone every star coming up over the ridge. Their courtship, in the 2 months that followed, was as plain and steady as the proposal had been, built out of shared suppers and long Sunday walks along the creek, where he taught her the names of the wildflowers she'd once found waiting on her desk, and told her, slowly, of the parents buried in the little churchyard who had built this ranch out of nothing. She told him of Ohio, of her mother's sewing room, of a girl who had once dreamed of a garden she would never see. They were married in October in the small clapboard church in Piner Creek, with Mrs. Dunmore standing as witness and weeping openly into a handkerchief, and the whole town turning out because they had all, in their own way, watched the story unfold and understood that this ending had been earned. Evelyn wore a dress she'd sewn herself from blue calico, and Caleb wore a suit that fit him poorly and looked, all the same, like the happiest man in the territory. 5 years passed, as years will, and on a golden evening in late summer, Evelyn sat in a rocking chair on that same porch, mending a small shirt in her lap, while a girl of 4 with her father's serious eyes sorted river stones into careful piles at her feet. Caleb came and settled into the chair beside her with the particular sigh of a man who has worked hard and is glad of it, the smell of dust and cattle still clinging to his shirt. He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, familiar as breathing. Their son, 6 years old and fast as a rabbit, came tearing around the corner of the house, chasing a barn cat with a stick held aloft like a cavalry saber, and Caleb's low, amused voice called him off before he'd gone 3 more steps. The boy abandoned the chase at once, grinning, and came to lean against his father's knee. And Caleb's hand settled easily onto his son's head. Evelyn looked out at all of it, her husband, her children, the low golden light lying warm across the yard, and felt something in her chest settle into a peace she had not known all those years ago on that empty platform, that a person could feel so completely. Behind them, through the kitchen window, the last of the evening light was pouring gold across the floorboards, and it struck her, not for the first time, that this window did not face east and never had, and that it had never once mattered, not truly, because the light she had been promised had never really been about which direction a window faced at all. It was a strange thing, she thought, how a lie could sometimes be the crooked road that led a person somewhere far better than the truth ever would have. Caleb glanced over at her and seemed, without her saying a word, to know exactly what was moving behind her eyes. "Still can't rightly believe how long those old ledgers sat in such a state before you got hold of them," he said, a teasing warmth in his voice. "You were a slow man about a great many things," she agreed, and felt her mouth curve into a smile she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. "It's a fine thing you turned up to sort them out," he said, and then, quieter, more certain, "It's a finer thing you turned up to sort me out." They sat together as the light went from gold to violet to the first scattering of stars, the house behind them warm and lit and full of the ordinary precious noise of a family. And it was, Evelyn thought, exactly as full as a house was ever meant to be. Not empty. Never empty again. A home built not on paper and pretty promises, but on the plain, steady, unshakable devotion of a good man who had never once needed fine words to prove it. Sometimes the thing that breaks our heart is the very thing that walks us toward what was meant for us all along. Evelyn didn't need pretty words or promised gardens. She needed someone who showed up every quiet morning with wild flowers and steady hands. Real love rarely announces itself. It just keeps showing up. Trust the good that comes after the disappointment, friend. It's often better than what you lost. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for your entertainment, though we hope its gentle lesson about patience and quiet love found a little place in your heart.